So, did you get home late last night?
Not too bad.
No?
Yeah. I mean, I enjoyed our time out. I thought it was good.
Yeah, it's good having a hang, with the guys at the BCMT. I was telling Ben what a good hang we had, and it's a lot of fun.
Unstructured time, I think, is really important.
Yeah.
Because when we are structured, we end up, it's too restrictive.
Yeah.
And you need that time for like a free flow of thought and feeling to.
Yep. I was telling Jonathan Rivera what a good hang you are. And he said that you're doing a DR with him, directed study.
It's brand new.
Yeah. And I said, make sure that you get Dr. Waddell, if you can, direct you. Sharon, you can come in. So there's such a thing called post-editing. It's amazing.
Yeah.
We can make sure that this doesn't appear. Although having you bring him coffee would actually be kind of the way podcasts are today. That's actually the way to do it. Yeah. Doesn't have to be edited. You don't even have to edit that out, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Planned informality.
Yeah. A little planned informality. I told Jonathan that the best way to get you, if you can, is to, instead of just sitting in the classroom, go out and do something human, because that's... those usually are our best interactions.
I think so too.
Which makes me think, just all the stuff today that we have that's so curated, doing something more human seems to kind of cut through the noise mostly. Yeah,
everything. There's value to excellence and to high production quality, but not all of our lives are so produced.
Yeah,
but we've grown into a certain, I might call it overproduction, where we see ourselves as kind of characters in our own stories, and everything is a pseudo of a veneer of actual life.
Yeah,
it's not real.
The curated life.
Yeah.
Dr. Sims asked you a really interesting question last night in the car, which I thought your response was phenomenal. And he said, you've been teaching at SCU for now 20 years. You've been in academia for 30 years, safe to say, about that. And he said, what's the difference between a student now and a student 10 years ago, even 20 years ago?
Yeah, so, part of what makes a student is kind of doing student things. I hear people say sometimes, they'll say we're human beings, not human doings. And I can appreciate that to a certain degree. There's a certain level of wisdom there, that our identity, our essence is in our being. We're not reducible, certainly not to our accomplishments. And that's the over-curated way of looking at things. But we are not, it is impossible to separate what we do from who we are. Like, I might tell a lie, but if that is uncharacteristic of me, people wouldn't know me as a liar. But if I lie every day, if I lie to myself, if I suffer from some kind of pathology, I'm not just telling a lie, I am a liar. And we might have people who have enrolled in programs who even pay tuition. But if they're not attentive, if they're not present, if they're not putting in effort, if they're not owning for themselves that identity, like they have to read a syllabus, they have to attend a class, they have to write a paper, they have to read, they have to contribute. It's at that point that they're a student.
And that's a phenomenal point, because I think you're talking about the making of a theologian or the making of a thinker.
Yeah.
And there's a term I think is really valuable, that information is not formation. You can produce information, but that doesn't mean that you've been produced at all to be a theologian or a thinker, the way that you're presenting yourself. So what actually comprises a theologian to make them more than just the information that they're replicating or producing? Because what I love about you, Robby, is you've been doing this a long time and you are formed. You actually were a big part of my own formation. What would you say is formative?
Yeah, I think that back to our identity, who we are and what we do. I mean, the same goes for Christ, right? You can't separate the person of Christ from the work of Christ. What he did, of course, is invaluable, unique, ultimately important. But that's not separated from who he is. And it's the fact that he's the one who kind of did those things. For for me, and I think what you're saying, and what I hear you saying anyway, there's an old adage, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You can give information to a person, but you can't make them learn. You can't kind of make them a student. Learning is something that's very personal, and we have to kind of engage it ourselves. So I think the word that we're looking for is integrity. Like, all of these things have to integrate. One of the things I hear a lot about is having a good work-life balance. But I don't know that balance is the best metaphor, because balance imagines that all of these things are kind of separated and the 2 or 3 or 4 things never really meet. But that's not true. You are you wherever you are. And so whether you're a pastor or you're a father or a mother, a sister, an employee, a friend, a neighbor, you're still you in all those places. And all of those things have to integrate. And so it has a lot to do with just integrity and kind of being present with whatever you are doing or reading or learning.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I saw recently was somebody that was on their social medias, and they were giving a informative take, maybe a hot take or whatever it might be, but it was a lot of theology and thought and thinking. But that individual actually had dubbed themselves and their voice and put it over their lips, so it wasn't even them that was speaking, and it was clear that it was a script from some sort of chat AI program. So they're presenting themselves as knowledgeable, but clearly themselves really hasn't attained the knowledge to actually speak in the manner that they're speaking. So it gave me thought and pause to think about in the AI world, in the social media world, where we can grab clips and grab things and talk about them enough for 1 minute to be convincing or enough for 3 minutes to be convincing, having never really developed or formed around that in the process of learning. We curate ourselves as thinkers and as learners, but we're not there. And so my concern is that making sure that education is still a formative process when access is everywhere.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, and a sad story too, that someone somehow felt the need to pretend to be something that they're not. Just some honesty at that point would be helpful. But yeah, to your point about formation, it is that. So it's not just information. It is shaping. Like we are people, and as people, we consist of more than just our ideas. Right. This is Lewis's argument in Abolition of Man, that we have become heads without chest, right? Brains, minds without hearts. And it's a good point that he's made. And then others have carried it further to say, well, it's not enough just to have a brain and a heart, but you also have a body, and you are who you are. And so a more kind of robust anthropology, kind of just understanding what it means to be human, and that we are human, and that's not something that needs to be lamented or overcome. I mean, I think our finitude and all the limits that come with it are not a flaw. It's a feature to how we were created. All the way from Maslow's needs, our basic needs, to ideas of learning. Like, I don't know everything. I need to learn something. That doesn't make me somehow a problem. It's just what we are. The fact that we need each other in the same way that we need food or clothing or shelter or rest is the connecting points that we have with one another. Like I need relationships, right? I need, and that need is met through a friend or a colleague, a brother or sister in Christ. And the same goes with God. Like we are made in such a way that we're not complete, or we're not self-sustainable or self-autonomous without God and without others and without those needs. But that's what it means to be human. That's a gift. That's the fullness of who we are, not some again some flaw or some problem that needs to be overcome.
Yeah. The variety that I see, I was talking to Chris Green about this. We were talking about how when you go, and we had this conversation in your office actually, is that when you open up social media, whatever platform you're on, you're immediately exposed to an explore page that has all kinds of curated bits of information. And just on any given day, you're flooded with tons of information about various things, which could be included with contrasting viewpoints, variations and iterations of theology. If you scroll for an hour, 2 hours, you've seen this type of theology, that type of theology, this sort of philosophy, that sort of philosophy. And then, of course, you have first-person accounts, this testimony of this, which could conflict with this testimony of that. And then you see suffering and torture. You see all kinds of headlines everywhere. The worst takes on things, maybe someone's the best takes on things. And so in an hour or two, you've been flooded with all this information. And then as people who don't know everything and people who are ultimately being shaped, at some point there has to be courage to make a decision, like epistemic courage, to actually believe something or find yourself in a constant state of not knowing what to believe. Where do you find, do you think, the beginning point of having a framework to develop that you can trust to start filtering information as to what you may or may not believe so that you're not double-minded, going back and forth on something, which goes back to formation? How can you accomplish that?
It is. I think it's harder today than it's ever been. A number of years ago, Neil Postman wrote a book called "Amusing Ourselves to Death." So to muse, right, means to think. So amusement means not to think, like an amusement park means that it's a place where you're no longer having to think. You're just kind of
you're at Cedar Point, going down the roller coaster.
Right. You're just thinking. Being enjoying something, and not that it's a bad thing to enjoy a roller coaster, but we have amused ourselves to death. And in it, Postman compares and contrasts George Orwell's vision of the future, where he thought information would be censored, right? Would be censoring books. And we are doing some of that, very sadly, but things would be kind of kept from us. We wouldn't be taught kind of how to read. We wouldn't have access to information. And then Huxley, in A Brave New World, his vision and fear of the future was very different, that we'd be so overwhelmed with information that we'd no longer do it. So it wasn't that books would be taken away from us, but rather that we'd have so much information available that no one would be reading anymore. And I think it's Huxley's fear that is more our danger than Orwell's. And that's so what we do, what do we do in a nihilistic society where nothing seems to have meaning anymore? I don't think the answer to that is just more thinking, or just trying to return to a few kind of foundational cores, like.
And how would you even decide those?
Yeah, exactly. Great point. I think the way forward, Nietzsche actually wasn't in favor of nihilism. He just thought it is what it is, and so we should just go ahead and will to power and make it the best we can.
Accept it and create your own values that work for you.
Yeah, exactly. For me, in my Christian faith, I always kind of go back to Jesus. I think he is the fullest and truest revelation of who God is. And I think Jesus has given us practices, habits that have become part of our tradition. And, of course, the scriptures are very important, but the scriptures are not in isolation. They're not in an abstract, field somewhere. We have a real God and we are real people. This is in real places, in real time, and with real bodies, in real relationships, in real context. And so on the one hand, we want to be consistent with our tradition, but on the other hand, we want to be innovative, right? The church is whatever we do next, right? Because we are the church. And so I think I would, back to that idea of a fuller anthropology, I would encourage particularly young people and old alike, really, to be faithful in their habits, their practices, and to seek the wise and walk with them. Like the ancient paths are there because people have used them and they are helpful. And so that's what we should do too. Trust in a living God, have practices that are consistent with the ancient, doctrine of the church, and be faithful witnesses in a world that is pluralistic and is in a pretty constant state of flux.
Yeah, and through faithful witness, which is a big theme in the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, which is the way it ends. And I think that's even prophetic, is that as we've kind of moved forward, as time has changed and ideas have changed and frameworks of thinking has changed, those abstractions don't seem to cut through the noise. But there is still a conviction about faithful witness that seems to make sense of the chaos when there's people can't really create meaning and they're not sure, and it all becomes leveled and on a level playing field. For some reason, and maybe we don't even know why, a faithful witness does still make a difference and does stick out and seems to be something that you can at least aspire to and ground in.
Yeah, one of the things, at the end of Acts chapter 2, there are 4 things that are stated that the early church devoted themselves to. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and prayers. And so if we work in reverse order, we understand what it says, the prayers. It is articular. So they probably had certain prayers they were praying. It wasn't all just spontaneous. Like they'd been taught to pray. They'd been taught to pray certain things. They knew the prayers and they prayed them. The breaking of bread is an analogy or a metaphor for communion, right? They were receiving communion on a regular basis. Fellowship, I think we know what that is. But then also the apostles' teaching, that this is a received faith. It was passed from person to person. So Paul will say all Scripture is inspired and good for reproof and training and teaching in righteousness. But before he says that, he says, I want you to remember what you have learned and from whom you have learned it. So for Timothy, that would be Paul, but it'd also be Lois and Eunice, his mother and his grandmother. And again, it is layered like that. And so we receive these things. So in the Revised Common Lectionary for this upcoming week, the Old Testament passage is out of Nehemiah. And it's a beautiful passage where they're reading the Torah and they're reading it out loud in public. But then it says they're offering an interpretation so that people will understand it. So the idea that, here's something that's true, but it's not so easily accessible. There's someone else needs to interpret so that others can understand. So the idea that, there is a lot of information out there and there are a lot of opinions out there, but they're not all equal. Mm-hmm. So there was a time, not that long ago, that if you wanted information, you had to come to a university. Like those were the places where they were. You had to go to the library. Now, of course, all of that's available. I mean, everything is online. Except, how do you know what's what? Like, how do you know
where do you begin to even form? Like,
it's
not about learning; it's about learning how to learn.
Yeah, and learning how to think.
Learning how to think.
It's being able to evaluate the quality of the resources, or the arguments, or the positions, and there is something to be said for experts and for those who have studied. And they have learned it from others and they're passing it down. And I mean, the idea, it's not that all of that is like, it's without a doubt going to be always right. Because, I mean, we do, even not just individually, but collectively, we do kind of grow and change. But it sets some guardrails, right? It gets us started. It gives us some parameters, and I think that's valuable and I think we need it.
It seems that when you go onto social spaces, I mean, there is a lot of polarization. There's a lot of vitriol, a lot of anger. And one of the things that I've talked to students about is why higher education is really a great experience, because it's so refreshing. Because in spaces of higher education, there may be some places, but for the most part, people that have gotten their terminal degrees and have kind of been teaching in the classroom for a while, they may disagree on things. But for the most part, in my experience, maybe you can testify to this, it's amicable, that there is a place to disagree and do it friendly without feeling so threatened by everything. But it doesn't seem to be that way in the public sphere, or the town court, or the courtyard.
Yeah.
And I was reading an article about Kierkegaard and how he sort of feared the public square, because he felt that everybody would just, and this public square is a place where you could exchange ideas freely, but he saw that there was a detriment to that, and that is everybody could listen to anyone speak, and there was just going to be an endless amount of listening, but never really a decision point where you had to make a decision about anything. So people became endlessly critical without ever having to commit to anything. It was just, who's the next person that I can come along and criticize? And then you ask the individual, well, what did you think, or what do you believe? Well, you ask the critic that. They don't know, but they know that they're here to criticize the next person that comes along. And so we don't have a public square today, typically, where we do that, but that's what our social media has become. And it's produced a level of vitriol where I think it radicalizes people in a lot of ways. And they're even more convinced that I'm just going to keep bearing down on these things. And it seems like they fear that the world they once knew is being taken away. And then we need to fight for this, even if it brings out the worst in ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, you've brought up a lot there. I mean, definitely we suffer from some binary thinking that we always talk about. Even some of the better folks will say, well, what about the other side? The problem with that is it's already reduced things to two sides, as though that's the rubric. You're either with us or you're against us. And but that's just not true. Not only are things far more gradated than that,
Complex.
yeah, and they're complex, but they go in other directions too. It's not all linear, and so yeah, that idea of resentment. Everybody's a victim, and therefore anybody who disagrees is the enemy, and views that shouldn't be. Like in religious settings, we would say there are views that are essential and there are views that are not essential, and we certainly don't want to disfellowship someone over something that's kind of non-essential. But yet everything now is essential, right? Mm-hmm. My political views and my religious views have become inseparable, and we can't differentiate with all that. Alistair McIntyre says something that I really agree with when it comes to tradition. He says the difference between a living tradition and a dead or dying tradition is that a living tradition is continuing to interrogate its central beliefs. And once those central beliefs are no longer up for question, then the tradition is either dying or it is dead. And so I mean, if he's right, and I think he is, not only are non-essential things something that we shouldn't disfellowship over, but even sometimes what we might think is essential, we would have some latitude for variety of belief. Like there's not, we are not the judge. I mean, we know the judge is, name's Jesus, and back to your reference to Revelation, he's coming back, but he can be trusted. He can be trusted to do what's right and to judge in such a way that not just separates but also restores. The Spirit is that which brings us together and kind of holds us together. And if anything, I think one of the things that the Spirit might be up to in the present and in the future is going to be a response to all of the vitriol of which you speak and all of the division. Like, I don't think that won't last forever because it is so destructive. So in a way, we have to kind of get over ourselves, and whether we have been harmed or we think we might be harmed, or, we've been the victim of this, that, or the other, realizing that people who disagree are not an enemy. They're not morally flawed. They're thinking differently than we are.
You've been teaching biblical hermeneutics for a long time.
Yeah.
Me and Bishop Sharona call you the technician. That's the way that you can look at a text and work at it with the Greek and find nuance that's in there. And even when we were driving with Dr. Sims yesterday, we were talking about a particular passage in Luke. You're able to call out an anarthrous noun and explain that. It was brilliant, which is phenomenal and all that. How do, when we're working from the text and we're looking at biblical hermeneutics, how much of ourselves go into that? What I mean by that is, what does it take to make a healthy hermeneut? Because over time, I thought it can't just be our biblical methodologies, because there's a part of ourselves that we bring to Scripture that causes us to interpret. And if there's parts of ourselves, regardless of our frameworks, that are not healthy, that are not yielded to the Spirit, that are not submitted to God in prayer, it's just hard for me to think that our interpretations are going to come out correctly or in a way that really brings any sort of unity to the church or brings anything good to our liturgy, to our communities, and to our worship, because there's something in me that's broken that keeps me from getting to what the Spirit is saying from the text.
Oh man, that is so insightful, and it is so much better than what I often hear. So we don't know how to read well. Back to that passage from Nehemiah, an interpretation was offered them so that they might understand, because they weren't going to get it when they were just kind of hearing it on their own. So the idea that everybody should just go off by themselves and read their Bible and have their existential experience, and that whatever they need is just readily available, I think is misguided. Jesus on the road to Emmaus interpreted, that's the word hermeneuo there. He interpreted the scriptures for those disciples so that they might see the way in which the Hebrew prophets spoke of him as the Christ. It's not something that they would have gotten to necessarily on their own. They had a teacher, and he taught them how to best interpret those texts. And so the church would follow that for centuries. Like, we would have these kind of Christological readings, particularly of the Hebrew scriptures. And that became the way in which we would understand just who Jesus of Nazareth is. And so now we've substituted a lot of that for something that's more scientific or something that's a bit more technical. And we do our best to do, historically, culturally sensitive exegesis, interpretation. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that's not some magical key that's going to open everything, right? And so there's other things that we need to ask, other kind of literary things, not just historical things. But then we also need to ask kind of theological things or spiritual things, not just literary or theological ones. Because as you say, this is not just information. This is something that's forming us. So even the questions we ask, we always come as the master over the text, asking, what does this mean? When another question we could ask is, well, what does this do? Like, when I read this text, what does it do to me? So maybe the text is going to tell us what to believe, or maybe it's going to tell us what to do, or maybe it's going to offer us comfort, but maybe it's going to trouble us. Maybe the Spirit is going to use it to shape us, not just to inform us. And that takes time. That's what it takes. It takes good teachers, and it takes time, and it takes the Spirit, and it takes a life of devotion and prayer. And it's not just something that you master. It's something that, and and not like you took a course on biblical hermeneutics. I'm talking 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years of doing it. And then you do gain a certain level of skill at being able to kind of hear the voice of the Spirit in the text.
Yeah, I mean, you're leaning into Pentecostal hermeneutics right now, which I absolutely love. And this is what was so helpful for me, is because I've come out of, prior to being with Chris Thomas and yourself at Bangor, I was just using historical grammatical methods, and I was relegating my hermeneutical experience to, well, what does the text mean? And I look back on that, and I can see how that can be helpful, and it is, but I can also see how that can be somewhat harmful. If that's all that it is what does the text mean? It almost seems like once now I have the meaning, then it kind of puts me in a position of authority over people that don't have the meaning, and can make me almost irresponsible as to how I communicate that meaning or what I do with that from that point forward. But if I'm coupling that with not only what does this text mean, but what does this text do, and how is this text forming me, and how is this text shaping me, then I go beyond just using it for my own purpose. But I now have to conform to that and put myself in a position of submitting to the Spirit and submitting to the Lordship of Christ and to the author of the text. And that's never going to be in any way that demeans anybody or places or harms anybody.
Yeah, I think that that outcome is a really good one. Billy Abraham, in his little book, The Bible in the Impasse, or The Impasse of the Bible, I forget the exact title, but he kind of said that we can read the Bible epistemologically, that is, I want to know, or we can read it kind of soteriologically, where the Spirit is actively using Scripture in the saving process or sanctifying process of who we are, which is where Chris Green gets his idea for his book on hermeneutics, Sanctifying interpretation, that holy reading of a holy text makes us holy people. And it's holy people then who can read well the text. Like we know the voice of the Father because we have been shaped by the Spirit of the Father to kind of hear those things. And again, that takes time, and it's not simply an academic exercise, although it does include, Billy Abraham was an excellent kind of reader of Scripture, even though he's talking about kind of it's a soteriological reading and not simply. And I think that's the point. It's not either or. That goes back to the binary thinking. It's not like it's this method or that method. It's both and. Like, we have a lot to learn from historical critical method. We have a lot to learn from background studies. We have a lot to learn from literary studies. We have a lot to learn from theological studies. And all of those things are kind of used in the academy and in the church to help us understand. So with all of that with all of the emphasis for whatever 150 years or more on history, trying to figure out what actually happened or what was going on, we actually ended up ignoring the text that we had in front of us. So Hans Frey referred to it as the eclipse of the biblical narrative. The biblical story itself got eclipsed by all of the conversations we were having about historical matters. That doesn't mean, again, that historical conversations aren't helpful and important. It just means that it's not the end all.
It wasn't like we were talking about the Bible anymore. We were talking about the Bible. In a sense.
Yeah. That's what we do with God all the time anyway, right?
Right.
It's we don't always talk to God, but we talk about God.
Yep.
Which is, I think, the difference between Job and his friends. There's nothing that Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, or for that matter, Elihu, say to Job that is theologically problematic. Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, anything they say, we could pick it up and set it down in Proverbs, and it would sound exactly the same. What's problematic about it is that Job's in a particular situation and he's talking to God, and they're wanting to say to Job, they want to talk to Job about God.
Yeah.
And at the end of the story, God kind of commends it. Ricky Moore says this in an article that he wrote on Job, but God commends Job for talking directly to him, and then instructs Job to pray for his friends. So again, to talk directly to him.
Yeah, in the setting of, go ahead.
Yeah, just one more point on that. It's a subtle difference I think we hear in the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down in the green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. All of that's in the third person. That's when we're talking about God. Then it says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. Now it's shifted from third person talking about God to first person, or I guess it's second person from the perspective of the psalmist, talking now to God. And I think that's key, because when you're in green pastures and still waters and your soul's restored, I can talk about God all day long. Mm-hmm. But when I'm in the valley of the shadow of death, it's time for me to talk to God.
Yeah, I remember looking at Job. My thesis wasn't on Job; it was on Revelation. But in exploring the idea of theodicy,
right? It was on suffering, so Job comes into play. Yeah,
exactly. You have to deal with Job. And Simo recommended me a book about anti-theodicy, and it goes through Job and explores it. And the writer was making that very point: is that in Job's suffering, instead of his friends getting in that suffering with him and coming to God and around Job and talking and communing to God with Job while he's in the suffering, they were essentially pontificating about God. And they were laying over Job their theological prowess and their theological ideas about God. Even though they didn't announce them as theological ideas, it was a rational exploration of why your suffering is happening to you. And it was a principled exploration of why this is taking place, but it misses the mark because there was no contemplation, there was no prayer, there was no talking to God. It was just this I guess we could call it, even, it wasn't modern then, but it'd be kind of like a modern critical hermeneutic now about God.
Yeah, I think, it's possible. Of course, that's a little anachronistic to read that back on it, but I don't think it's a bad thing. Coming back around to the psalm again, if it's true that the Lord's a good shepherd, and we'll say, yes, what we said about God there is not wrong, even though we're talking about God. If the Lord's a good shepherd, why am I in the valley of the shadow of death? Like, if he's my shepherd, should he not have prevented me from being there? Yeah. And one way to read that is, well, that's the problem of free will. We blame everything on free will, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not that the shepherd's a bad shepherd. It's just that I make bad choices. And so now I find myself in bad situations. Certainly that's possible way to read that. But an alternative maybe way of reading it is the Lord is my shepherd. And if I follow my shepherd, I will not only find myself in green pastures and still waters, I will also find myself in the valley of the shadow of death, because that's where he went. I heard Chris Green say once in a sermon on Psalm 23 that the shadow in the valley of the shadow of death is the shadow cast by the cross.
Cruciform life.
Yeah, that we can't expect, or ought not expect, not to be in the face of death if we're following a crucified Messiah.
It would be absurd to think otherwise.
Yeah, it would be, yeah. And so I'm in the valley of the shadow of death, not because I've done something wrong necessarily. It's possible that that's the case, but not necessarily. I might just be there because I'm following Christ. And in following Christ, that then leads me to a table which the Lord has prepared, but he's prepared it before me in the presence of my enemies. So I think the enemies are there at the table to eat, right? Because we're told over and over and over, love your enemies. Paul says in Romans 12, what do we do with our enemies? We feed them.
Certainly the way that after you've come out of the Gospels, you're going to read back into Psalm 23.
Yeah. And I think we see this in the Hebrew Bible too. It's an Elisha story. we often tell this story a lot. If you grew up Pentecostal, I know you've heard this story. It's a story where the king of Aram has brought his army, and they've surrounded Dothan. They've surrounded Elisha, and he says to Gehazi, his servant, goes out and sees, and goes, "Oh no, they're going to kill us. Nice working for you." And then he's like, he prays for them, he prays for him. He goes back out and he sees the army of the Lord. Yeah. We always stop the story right there. I mean, that's not the end of the story, but that's when we stopped reading. So the prophet would pray again, and the army would lose their sight, and they'd be brought, into Samaria and be surrounded by the king of Israel. And then he says, Father, what should I do? Should I kill them? He goes, well, you didn't capture them. No, you shouldn't kill them. You should feed them. They feed them and send them home. And it says that kingdom never attacked Israel again. So I think it's in the thread of Hebrew thought. It's just not the dominant theme. But then we see it here in the Psalm. And then, of course, we see it in Jesus and we see it in Paul. And I think, I think you're not going to get those kind of Christological readings, or to a point you were making, or I was hearing it in what you were saying earlier that I meant to comment on earlier. One of the ways you might read a text and say, well, I think this interpretation is good, is because it's historically sensitive, or because it pays close attention to the, to the grammar and to the literature. But another way you might judge whether or not an interpretation of a passage of Scripture is good is to ask, what effect does that interpretation have? Effective hermeneutics. And does this interpretation create in us love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control? Or does it create division and bitterness and egocentrism and a sense of, resentment? And I think that's actually a quality judgment, if we want to use a rubric, to what makes a good interpretation versus average or not so good interpretation, is to ask that question of affect.